Partly the inverted dark theory is difficult because it's personalized. It's not a non-technical term. I just use the term that comes to mind. In that, um, though, of course, as we know, it begins on the NSS, and then we could take some measure by looking at, for instance, Robert Kagan's view about the end of the unipolar power, and that it happens not because of some big military or financial change, but for the reason of the Kara, for the reason of the turn of the being. So, and Agamben has already foreseen this in his theorizing, where he largely follows the spirit of Heidegger. Long before this NSS moment, where I'm placing the, as it were, public center, because all the big theorists are responding to that, Zizek and so on, and the political insiders. Bolton has continued to, like a horse with the blinders on, go on as though nothing has happened. So maybe he's Wile E. Coyote, who hasn't looked down, or maybe the Bolton forces are stronger than we think. So this would indicate that Bolton forces are actually very self-confident. And since Bolton is no fool, I don't think that's a good idea to just act like it's merely a matter of his overlooking. He must have some reasons, Matthew Croynish, so on. He must have some reasons to believe that the forces of normalcy, which assert the primacist Atlanticist power, are on the right rudder, to use a Navy talk. And why not? There's much evidence to that. 72% of world GDP through treaty, formal treaty members who align with the Western Alliance is not the only thing that the Western financial system has, but also it has the power of the central clearing banks and the smooth rates on all those tens of trillions that are changing hands on the FX markets daily. So if you get those better rates, then it makes your life easier as a country. Otherwise, you're fucked. So that's why Russia has to become somewhat more, as it were, not just the Society of Russia for the Russians, a kind of like direct form of corrupt self-socialism, like using bribery. So if you're a parking meter attendant or something, okay, I'll accept a bribe, using bribery as a way to share the wealth, as it were, in the society. But also, I mean, I think that's a kind of something Russia has been unfairly attacked for, in a sort of the reframing of the liberal thing. Like, oh, they're so corrupt by the Fukuyama model. Remember, Fukuyama was in Ukraine right before the SVO. I couldn't believe there'd be a SVO because so many people would die. I just said that there can't possibly be. How could there be war? Biden's saying there's going to be a war. There's troops amassed at the border. Medical units are ready for the hemoglobin. I confess, at the time, I didn't believe that would happen at all. Because it's so, I mean, what can you say? Because it's accusations of tens of thousands of children being kidnapped and moved from their families, and it's so wild that you couldn't believe somebody would go in for this, but I think from the point of view of what I wanted to get into eventually, basically here I had to say, sort of pronounce a prayer to the inverted dark theory and sort of let it spill out into the material before beginning the video, as it were. But the beginning of the video, I would say, is let's rehash the Duke and Nick Land thing and look at it from the point of view of ethnos. So it's interesting that sort of geographically from a Lebensraum, so Lebensraum was changed the meaning and became almost the same thing as Grossraum when the Nazis, but originally had been a term of Friedrich Ratzel, and he had used it to mean that, for instance, that the South in America had totally different culture than the North because of the climate and so on. So there's the ground is the living ground, and it's part of the thing of the people, and it's not thought in a biological way. It's not thought as like there's an environment, the ground is the environment, and then there's the selective breeding according to the environment. That's one way to get your black swan probability expectations. I mean, black swan vulnerable probability expectations, which therefore can never, on principle, be true. But another way is through this Lebensraum way of thinking, where the ground is a living ground, and I suppose it's more like the kind of generic view of Native American. I mean, I guess I'm sort of like Generation X type person. So I think from Generation X type perspective, yeah, there was this kind of view, like you got it in that movie U-Turn with there's a certain view of what Native American spirituality is, or whatever, what the powwow really is. Of course, Oliver Stone is much older, and that brings it's sort of, I guess each generation is trying to tell the next one how to think or teach them something or something along those lines. But just physically, they're both right. England and Russia are at the edges, right, of judge relative to Paris. It's sort of the capital of. Strindberg said Paris was the capital of intelligence. The Russian nobility spoke French. You know, Alexander II's family spoke French much better than they did Russian. If they had to speak about anything complex, they couldn't do it in Russian. France and the notion of the rights of man and the citizen. So I was just watching something on, oh God, what is it called? There's some debate on one of these podcasts, one of these popular podcasts, and the subject was basically what I would call the harm principle as against freedom. Like then they were talking about COVID. They were talking about, oh, you should have had the freedom not to wear the stupid masks and so on. Actually, I know a guy, a Polytechnique guy, who went to school in that, Michelle Wellenbeck environment, who's still wearing his mask, who's voluntarily still, to this day, still wearing his mask. I don't know why. I asked him directly several times. Almost everyone else doesn't feel, it thinks it's too rude even to ask. And I was given answers which were sort of like sufficiently meandering that I sort of by the end I couldn't muster any objection and wasn't quite sure exactly whether a justification had been given or not as answers. But in any case, I think this Parisian power is in a way overlooked in all these discussions. But what does it amount to? It's I think the principle in the rights of man and the citizen is the principle that leads into the harm principle. So the division is, on the one side you have harm, which is like the lowest Platonic notion like good being like health, because the idea being most people agree on sort of if having a broken arm is worse than having a sound arm or whatever, health. And health, I mean, I guess health has a wider application if you think about how the way Plato talks about the difference between cosmetics and health, salutariness. Isn't that what Locke places in the center? So I think partially, and then this has to be juxtaposed against what? Against things like Holy Mother Russia. So that would be one thing. If you have Holy Mother Russia, if you have empire, which is first of all for itself, and not for the not first in an empire. The church is subordinate. The church is subordinate. I think in a system like liberalism, the church is more powerful. But the church means then the so-called globalist project, the Atlantic Council project, as represented partially by the theory of efficient markets. Market fundamentalism, so-called, so that's part of it, along with the join the club theory of the West. Become one of us, join the club, become a full treaty member, and you can enjoy some kind of aura still, because you'll be remembered for your what you've done for the cause or something. Just as it seems sort of in a certain way like Paris, it's no longer that center. It's no longer sending out that powerful signal, but we remember its cultural significance, right, somehow. But is it just a cultural significance, or is it actually part of something that's actually still active? What would that be? And it essentially, beside from being, as I just said, the question of the harm as against something else like religiosity, or something else like higher considerations than mere harm, more something moral rather than something calculable. And then we get into this whole regime, I think, of the calculative man and Nietzsche's Last Man, and the idea of the, being able to account for man, as it were, being able to count on man. So something like the Schmittian dangerous, is human being still dangerous? Is still able to hatch out of its orifices noxious things out of a great Grand Canyon or whatever? Is it still a living entity? Does it still have its cartoon functions? And so you could see in this problem coming out of the what's now called the harm principle, and what's now argued on these podcasts as a matter of freedom as against government power, but which would be something like originally it was like you could do whatever you wanted as long as it didn't harm anyone else. But then what does harm mean? Because what you're doing is burning the flag or something, and then there has to be court cases that come out and say whether this is actually harmful or not, or whether, and then they sort of they decide on the interpretation that actually it's part of the tradition is to be able to burn the flag. Though certainly nobody thought that during, for the first 100 years of the country. Because they would have taken the side of the taking seriously those actions. in a direct way, rather than treating them as speech. So I would challenge in a way whether, this Anglo origins of liberalism that Dugin and Nick Land are arguing about are sufficient. But so again, like I was saying, there's certain similarities between these peoples, which is interesting. And Mikhail Skobelev, the great late 19th century Russian general, who was bent and determined on defeating the British in battle, nonetheless, said there's a unity on some of the qualities of the British and the Russians. They have the desperate resolve, adventurousness, and a genius for discipline. That they share these three qualities. I thought that was interesting in the light of the Dugin-Nick Land discussion. We have, I think it seems to me, what they're saying to signal liberalism as Locke is just Locke. It's true. It points to this switch. It points to this switch of the harm principle as against various other types of principles, moral principle, or the principle of the empire, the empire that has to be self-sufficient against all the other empires and isn't in such a position of unipolar power, has to look at things from the point of view of a global project, as merely sort of the mopping up in a sweeping fashion of the horizon of the globe. There's different patterns which go with different ways, but so I think in the inverted dark theory here, we should be thinking about the fact that since with the what we've been talking about in the last few times, with this new moment of recognizing what Agamben's recognized for a long time, this sort of course it's different in Italy, but this situation of the end of the attempt to conceal the thing and the full power of the thing. So I think, there are some behaviors or whatever in Rock Hudson or whatever, and then there's things that were concealed, and then today they're praised, and there's part of the ordinary background, part of the background of the generation that people come to be in, and maybe know nothing else, but part of the Dasein of the people. So we have this situation where it's correct what they're saying, but also what Agamben's doing when he sort of claims to radicalize Foucault is to say that this thing was already happening before Locke. This thing goes all the way back to the Homo Sacer. The law was never what it claimed to be, and there's always something in it of this mission civilatrice, or however it's called, this power that wants to be able to count on what it has before it, as something accountable to it, as something it can calculate on, something it can count on, calculate on, Geltung. So that there's something already in the original. Heidegger says what we think now, what the later Heidegger determines what the earlier Heidegger was thinking. So we can't read Being and Time the way Heidegger reads Heidegger unless unless we read Heidegger from the late Heidegger back into Being and Time, and then we see what was already there to be developed, as Agamben puts it, the Entwicklish Fähigkeit. So I think it's interesting to look at this debate again from the point of view of the qualities of the English and the Russians. I think much more antipathetic of the Germans. The Germans are a brusque people. They don't have a lot of time for strangers. They're in a hurry. Whereas both the Russian and the English, I think, are more of the glib peoples. They're much more willing to talk to people and to help the strangers along, and so on. And I think this is still true. What was said at the time of Mikhail Skobelev. This kind of trait is somehow still true, generally, of the Russians and the English, as opposed to the Germans and the Americans, I would say. Of course, the Americans are very mixed. There's a core of Americans that are Dutch from the New Amsterdam, and linked to some of the American founders by marriage, especially. And then there's different types of influences in America, right? There's the Boston Brahmins and this kind of thing. The Tucker Carlsons or what have you. How did they call it? I think that's a Straussian point in a way, the daughters of the American Revolution, as though to say that this is the most conservative group, but it's the group that's celebrating the most radical moment. Constantly. Let me end this by reading something of Nietszche, which seems to be superimposable on Aristotle. Nietzsche almost never mentions Aristotle, in which we could use not as the last word, but as the most current word, which determines what everything that was said before this is about. Ein Instrument, etwas van Slava, zwaar die substantially art Sklava, aber an sich nicht. An instrument for a slave, for the sublime slave thing, but that in its ist sich nichts. But nothing in itself. All right, so this is a very. We should look at this in a very it's a dreadful, terrifying statement, because what it's saying is this which the harm is about, judging things by harm rather than by what happens in the chapel and the personal belief about what's right or wrong, and the Mitt Romney thing, but judging by the mercenary. Strauss used to call it the mercenary low rascals calculations, mercenaryism. Um, what do I get paid for this? What is it paying me? Um, so yeah, more and more a refined tool that brings about things more and more predictably, more as Hume wanted. I mean, Hume has said, oh, there's, yeah, you can get, if you just have one guy doing something, it's not going to be sufficient. But if you have a bunch of dummies doing it, then it's a much more reliable. I mean, that you could apply that to any university department, because they self-create and self-propagate their own structures, their own levels. So there's the machines for this in operation. So, I mean, this is sort of a Nietzschean ask. What Nietzsche is saying is liberalism itself is this accountant's way of thinking, is this accounting and trying to make things countable and trying to make things that you can count on type of way of doing things. It's not the adventurous way of living. And then that attached to some kind of comfortable self-preservation theory or something.